you all so much for joining us tonight to hear from our brilliant guests, Christopher Ho, Daisy Nam, Hwan Kim, and bonus guest, Brendan Fernandes. So I regret that Chitra is unable to join us tonight, but I know we're gonna have an amazing and dynamic discussion regardless. And I'm just so pleased to co-present with tonight's conversation with Paper Monument, the publisher behind BEST. And I would like to introduce now Rachel Ossip, the manager of Paper Monument and managing editor of N+1 magazine. Rachel?
Thanks so much, Lisa. We're just so happy to be here today and get to hear more from Hwan Kim and Brendan. And it's been such a pleasure working with Daisy and Chris on this project. Since 2007, Paper Monument has worked to publish writing on art in the art world that opens up different forms of knowledge to broader audiences. One of the many ways that the press has long done this is working in an anthology format that constellate many, many voices on a single topic. And this mode of publishing does so much work, especially when concerning a topic like identity, especially Asian American identity, which is inherently and incredibly pluralistic. Chris and Daisy initially approached Paper Monument in very early 2020, and our first discussions about this book began on March 4th of 2020, which was obviously before the lockdown and before the pandemic. And we began working in earnest in April, which was before the murder of George Floyd by police. And then the manuscript was completed before the murders in Atlanta this year and the rising news of violence against Asian Americans in this country. And there's so many ways in which one wants a publication to be prescient, but these are none of them. But reading through the manuscript now is not only reading a chorus of over 75 different versions of what it means to be Asian American in this moment and in the art world, but also a chorus of what it meant to live through 2020, which is a year that we can only hope will be unlike any other in our lifetime. It's been an incredible pleasure, again, to work with Chris and Daisy on this project and to have this record of the past year, and looking forward to hearing so much from the contributors. Thanks so much for having us.
Well, thank you, Rachel. We appreciate that. I have to say, I'm super excited tonight because when I read, excuse me, when I read that this collection of letters was going to be published, I immediately reached out to Christopher to ask if he and Daisy would be willing to hold a discussion with us with A4 about the project. And of course, I was so excited when he said yes, because of course I'm a big fan, but also because A4 is, you know, we're all about amplifying and uplifting Asian American voices. And I believe we need to hear these voices, these stories from our community, you know, now more than ever. But of course, I need to take a moment just to recognize the pain being experienced by our larger community due to yet just another tragic killing in Minnesota. And, you know, as Asian Americans, as people who've been historically marginalized and gaslit and othered, you know, we have to stand in solidarity with all oppressed people to ensure that we can all survive and thrive. So thank you for granting me that space. And for those of you who aren't familiar with A4 and are just joining us because our panelists are so amazing or because you love N+1, I want you to know about A4 because we are a 37 going on 38-year-old nonprofit organization dedicated to ensuring greater representation, equity, and opportunities for Asian American artists and cultural organizations. And we offer professional development programs and workshops. We do a lot of community building events, and we do a lot of conversations around Asian American issues and identity, like tonight. And we are the only service organization in the country that's dedicated to the professional development of Asian American artists across all disciplines. So I'm just gonna share a few more announcements before I introduce our panelists. So first, know that this event is being recorded for our YouTube and Facebook channels, and we'll be posting it after tonight. At the end of the panelist discussion, we'll open up the floor for your questions. So you can either type them into the Q&A box, which you can launch from the icon labeled Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen menu, or you can just send me a message via the chat function and I'll share whatever you feel more comfortable with. We also have closed captioning available via Rev. So if you'd like to enable the captions, also you should see a CC icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen menu that has the words live transcript below it. So just click on that icon to enable the captions. Few more announcements and thanks. Thank you to Priscilla Sun, our programs and communications manager, who's also an amazing person and always keeps me organized here and keeps our programs moving, as well as Lisa Boris and Rachel Ossip from N+1 for their support in making tonight's program happen. And then you, I'm thanking you and asking you, the audience, to do us a huge favor and fill out a post-event survey, because we're always trying to improve and shape our programs to be more relevant, to be better. So your input really matters. And I'm just asking you, just fill out the form. It's super quick, just a few questions. So please, we'll drop the link in the chat box and send it to you after the event. So please, we do read the comments. Also, we're hiring, yay. A4 is looking for a full-time development manager. So we'll share that position description in the chat box. You can also read about it on our website. So full-time, we'd love to have you join our team. And we have lots of upcoming events. I could just spend the next hour, I think, talking about all of our upcoming events. So I will just share a few of them. On Wednesday, April 28th, we're bringing back one of our professional development programs called Table Dish, and it's focused on music. So Table Dish is a career roundtable event that brings together professionals or industry insiders who dish out information and insider information about, specific fields. And if you sign up for this program, you get to meet with 3 professionals for 30 minutes each in small groups, and you can ask your questions, build your networking skills, build your professional network. And we've got some amazing music industry insiders to give you advice on topics from licensing to branding to finding a manager, finding gigs, all that great stuff. On Wednesday, May 5th, so earlier this year, or actually late last year, we launched a virtual residency program. It was the first of its kind for A4. We did it in the pandemic to bring artists together, and that program is now wrapping up. And the participants of this residency program are launching a collaborative website and a studio visit event where they're going to share some of the work that they created over the past 4 months of the residency program. So you can meet with them, learn more about it, see some of the stuff. It's really amazing because they're totally interdisciplinary, from, the only Filipina magician to the only Asian American blue man to writers and, social practice artists and filmmakers. They are so talented and really incredible. Dancers, it's great. So that's on the 5th. Then on the 6th, we're opening an exhibition in Chelsea Market in collaboration with Pearl River Mart to celebrate APA Heritage Month. And that exhibition, entitled Futures Ever Arriving, is curated by Sophia Park. And it features works by 5 Asian American artists that are inspired by the concept of Asian futurism. So that'll be fun. You can see that in the market through, I think it's June 27th. And then on Thursday, May 13th, we are participating in CAPA, the Coalition for Asian Pacific Americans annual APA Heritage Month celebration, with a program we're calling Asian Americans in Jeopardy. It's a virtual game show experience. So all the questions, all the answers, all the contestants, everything is all APA related. So just like, regular Jeopardy, right? So the host is going to be Kate Rigg. She's hilarious. And all the contestants are playing for an APA charity of their choice. It'll be on Zoom. So sign up for that. It's going to be really great. Our next town hall event takes place on May 18th. If you've never been to a town hall, it's a great way to learn about opportunities, events, projects, all of the great talented artists working in the APA community. So sign up, it's a lot of fun. It's like an hour, you get to meet people, learn about cool things. And May is also Mental Health Awareness Month. So on the 27th at noon, we're going to be hosting a program with licensed creative arts therapist Megu Kitazawa, excuse me. That was a lot. Sorry, I had to race through that, so apologies. But if you missed any of that, sign up for our biweekly newsletter. You can stay on top of all of these events and more, like our Asia Society Book Club partnership, and check out our website at aaartsalliance.org or follow us on social media. We're on all the channels there. And then I'd like to give thanks to people, all of our supporters who make these programs possible. Capital One, Con Edison, New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the New York City Council, the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of Governor Andrew Cuomo and the New York State Legislature, the National Endowment for the Arts, our new friends at Fiskars, Great Scissors, Peer Space, the Tiger Foundation, and just so many generous and lovely individuals like you. So if you want to be added to this list, or just you want to test out our new text to donate function, you can text A4DONATE to 202-858-1233, or you can follow the link and just donate. We appreciate it. Okay, so now before we really get started, just quick land acknowledgement. I know we're not meeting together, but prior to the Zoom world, we would be meeting in the A4 offices in the unceded lands of the Lenape and Canarsie people. So since we're doing this virtually, I'm going to share a digital land acknowledgement that was written by the Canadian theater artist Adrienne Wong. Okay. Since our activities are shared digitally to the internet, let's also take a moment to consider the legacies of colonization embedded within the technologies, structures, and ways of thinking we use every day. We're using equipment and high-speed internet not available in many Indigenous communities. Even the technologies that are central to much of the art that we make leaves a significant carbon footprint, contributing to changing climates that disproportionately affect Indigenous peoples worldwide. I invite you to join me in acknowledging all of this, as well as our shared responsibility to make good use of this time, and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship. So now, thank you. I would like to introduce you to our fantastic panelists. I'm going to read super abbreviated bios because I've gone on too long already, and you can read more about them on our website and, of course, their own sites. Okay, Christopher Ho is a speculative artist based in New York, Hong Kong, and Telluride, Colorado. His work has been exhibited in museums and galleries around the world, and he's currently at work on a solo exhibition for 56 Henry, right here in the Lower East Side, which will open on May 13th. You can read more about Christopher and his work at christopherkho.com. Our next editor, Daisy Nam. Daisy is the curator at Ballroom Marfa, a contemporary art space located in Marfa, Texas, Hipster, Texas. Previously, she was the assistant director at the Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts at Harvard and has curated and produced talks and screenings and performances and workshops at the School of the Arts at Columbia University and lots of other things. Brendan Fernandes works at the intersection of dance and visual arts, and his projects reflect a hybrid of ballet, queer dance hall, and political protest, always rooted in collaboration and fostering solidarity. I was really fortunate to see his collaboration at the Noguchi Museum in the fall of 2019, and oh my God, those costumes. So check out his website at brendanfernandes.ca. And of course, last but not least, Hwan Kim is a multidisciplinary artist whose work has been exhibited throughout the US, Asia, and Europe. And he is currently working on an installation for the Marie Jose and Henry Kravis Studio at the Museum of Modern Art to be shown later this year. So you can read more about Hwan and his work at sunghwankim.org. Okay, so enough of me. Christopher and Daisy, I hope you will please take it away by sharing a little bit about the genesis of this project and maybe how you selected the participating artists. Oh, unmute. Okay.
Thank you so much for that amazing introduction, and also to Rachel as well for that really beautiful way to set up this talk. Chris and I met in a reading group, a leadership group through Asia Art Archive in America. So a lot of these topics we were discussing over the course of a year, and we had met over a coffee and kind of organically started talking about what letters meant to us. And maybe you can share a little bit more about that meeting, that moment where we kind of discussed a book, Chris.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you so much to A4, Brendan, Sung, Lisa and Rachel. We met, as Rachel intimated, early 2020, before the pandemic, before the police murders. And at that time, we both independently were pursuing projects that related to letters. So I was drafting a letter to former students whom I thought I had failed as a Asian or Asian American mentor. And Daisy was also planning a program of live readings of letters of redress. And something I think struck a chord with us even then in 2020, without knowing that we would be all self-isolating for a year. Something struck a chord in terms of what was a unintuitive relationship between racial identity on the one hand and the kind of intimate communication that often a letter embodies or entails on the other. And so really this anthology, which includes amazing authors like Brendan and Sung, started out as a kind of question we asked ourselves. What's this relationship between racialized identity and intimate communication? And what might one format, the format of a letter, highlight or bring about in terms of what already then, because of our last president, were very pitched discussions about identity. And we really kind of wanted to round it out, not only in terms of thinking about, I know it's a very complicated term, and I'm going to ask Brendan about it later on in this talk because he addresses this in his letter. Not rounding out the discussion, not only in terms of addressing specifically Asian or Asian American perspectives, ethnically Asian perspectives, but rounding it out also in terms of maybe lowering the pitch of the discussion, right? Which was very pointed at the time. So we were wondering what would happen if we lowered the pitch by offering this format of a letter or suggesting this format of a letter to our contributors. And I'm going to pass it back to Daisy. And maybe Daisy, you could also, before we listen to some of the excerpts from Brendan and Sung, maybe also discuss the kind of process in going through and selecting the amazing contributors that we've ended up with.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really long and complicated process, and Chris and I went through so many discussions, but the thing that shocked us the most was how long our list had become, because we had originally said, oh, maybe 30 letters, and we can stop there. But by the end, we had lists of hundreds of people that we wanted to invite. And Rachel and Dushko Petrovic and Roger White, the editors at Paper Monument, said, well, you probably shouldn't do that. Like, it should actually be a little bit more focused. So we focused with mostly North American artists and writers and curators, or people who have been living in the States for a while, like Brendan. But also knowing that, Brendan and Sungwon travel and live elsewhere as well. I mean, it's part of the diaspora. So it was a really complicated way of selecting, but inevitably we had to stop at 73, so we did that. But we were just really surprised, like, how by putting this list together, people, our colleagues and people we know, it started off in like some of our communities, and then people suggested other people, and then we kind of became visible to our own selves, and we're like, wow, this is a huge community, and there are many communities together. It's not singular as well. So that was a kind of a big surprise to Chris and I, and it was a fun challenge too. And we hope that this is not monolithic. Like, this is not comprehensive. We want other people to say, like, why didn't you include this person? And then also create other forms of exchange, and hopefully this kind of just is the beginning for many other projects to happen in the future. But yeah, I wondered also, for the contributors here, like, I don't know if you guys actually know each other, Brendan and Sungwon. So that was also a kind of other maybe utopic idea of people within the contributors list getting to know each other as well. But maybe we could start with a reading of one of the letters. And I know that Shitra Ganesh wanted to be here, but she couldn't. So I'm gonna help Sungwon read. I think we have some images as well because their exchange is visual.
And
Yes.
while you set up the images, I just want to give, I know some people haven't seen this book yet, but Sung Hwan and Shitra Ganesh had a perfect kind of long-standing correspondence between the two that was in SMSs and WhatsApp messages and emails, and I'm sure in person as well. And because this exchange was an exchange over time, sometimes in fragments, in some ways it perfectly highlights the kind of possibilities and also the kind of gaps of productive gaps that can happen in communications between two close friends. So that would be the preface to this reading.
Yes. Should I start?
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you, first of all, inviting us, Chitra and me, for this lovely publication and this reading. I know that Chitra would have loved to be here because we're both very thrilled to, well, we're always very excited to have conversation, and we've known each other for 20 years now. We met in 2001. And since this smartphone, just a phone, but the fact that the function that we have now using images and that you can take a picture of the book that you're reading and the image quality really delivers when you send it to another person, so that that person can also read what I'm reading, but you don't have to discuss in length what that is. And those insights are now being communicated between friends, even though you're not together at the same place, right? So this kind of opportunity that we're given to publish this made us sort of make the insight into a document. So we think about what we're feeling or thinking, but also it's documented so we can reflect on it afterwards. So thank you for that. And so I just start reading the gutter. And these, this is from, these two images are from the book called Yakdongi and Yongpari, which are the names of the two characters, written by this graphic novel or manga, manhwa in Korean is called, author Bang Young-jin, and he was born in 1939. And just to give the context, 1937 is the beginning of the great tension between and war between Japan and China, and it's also the foreshadowing of the Pacific War that's going to happen starting in 1941 with Pearl Harbor. So this is sort of like a historical background, and then this book itself was first published in 1962 in Korea. I chose two sets of two cuts showing before and after lighting a match. So you see the first image of this boy lighting a match, and then he is putting the fire onto a stack of hay. And the second set, the night shown by the moon, you see the moon behind one of the speech bubble there, versus a moment later with a lit up matchstick.
Your fire in two cuts illuminates the gutter. The gutter is a space in between two panels in a comic. Gutters indicate the passage of time, the transformation of space, etc. Sometimes the gutter reveals itself as a flow of a river. The gutter also reminds me to read between the lines.
Do you have the rest of the bullet points? For example,
I actually do not have that, I'm sorry.
For example, the mosaic floors of Palestrina show a literal and metaphoric fluidity in the relationship between Egypt and Rome, a fluidity that would later be dissolved when the Roman Empire was appropriated as a root of the Western civilization. These scenes are Nilotic landscapes. I find it interesting that Nilotic languages constitute a large subgroup of the Nilo-Saharan languages spoken in South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, and northern Tanzania. Among these are the Luo, Sawa, Maasai, Kalenjin, Dinka, Nuer, Shilluk, Adakar, and the Ma-speaking peoples. Another example of two cuts with fire, Driven Out, Jean Felser, first published in 2008. A page from this book shows a Chinese town before arson and after arson. You see in the caption, Market Street, Chinatown in San Jose before the fire, 1887, in the first image. And the second image shows white citizens observe the burning of Chinatown of the same place. Felser, a scholar of American history at Humboldt State University in 1974, first notices the absence of Asian students in her school where she teaches. She notices this absence during meetings against the Vietnam War and for Native American rights. A local poet informs Felser that the absence of Asian students resulted from their memory of the massacre of the Chinese in Eureka in 1885. 30 years later, Felser embarks on her research on Chinese immigrants living in the US between 1850 and 1906. One fact from her research, out of the at least 302 lynchings that occurred in California between 1849 and 1902, 200 were of Asian people.
A San Jose I never knew about before you showed me this page, a Chinatown I wish I saw with my own eyes.
Similar ideas to this are repeated by members of both major political parties to eventually justify the burning of habitats. War of extermination will continue to be waged between the two races until the Indian race becomes extinct. While we cannot anticipate this result with but painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power and wisdom of man to avert. Peter Burnett, the first governor of California. And I know the image was not prepared, but to make, this is just an excerpt. And so we prepared another, just a reading. We'll just read this part about the noguchi that's in the book. Basic knowledge that I had a noguchi before 2017. This is my text to Chitra. He made beautiful furniture and Zen gardens. And then I crossed out he was Japanese because I only knew him as Japanese. I didn't know so much about him from the name. He made smooth surfaces. And then I found a paragraph from a book that I read to Chitra, Whiteness and Cultural Privilege in Post-War America. Only some artists, typically white heterosexual men, were credited with successfully integrating the primitive, in quotation, into an art that seemed universal, in quotation, because it crossed racial, ethnic, and linguistic lines to communicate a liberal, even progressive cultural viewpoint. As our art historian Anne Gibson explains, women, artists of color, and homosexuals could not do this because their audience, in quote, would not accept their work as universal. Even if they wanted to be universal and said so, the dominant society did not read the work that way. Thus, if a woman made art and presented it as an exploration of issues of universal significance, it might well be read as deriving from her, in quote, feminine identity, rather than the broadly human identity she aspired to represent. Identity drove the analysis and meaning of Noguchi's work too, as much as he tried to make it address broadly shared humanistic concerns. Its meanings were limited by the same assumptions about his Japanese-ness that had inflected the reception of his, well, that's the end of the picture that I took. And Chitra said, you don't have this writing. You said, right, Daisy? Yeah.
I actually do have this
Okay, could you read
writing.
it? Yeah.
I need to read. And so Chitra responds to someone's excerpt of that text with, and what you told me about Noguchi's work being described as, quote, too clean and smooth, unquote, as if his Asian masculinity itself was being evaluated and dismissed, while his engagement with farmland, industrialization, and socialism is omitted and depoliticized.
That's the end of our reading.
That was incredible, and that's almost a perfect pivot to our next reading by Brendan Fernandes. And actually, even before we go on to there, I have a question for both Hwan and Brendan. This quotation about artists of colors and homosexuals and women not being able to address universal concerns, not because they don't want to or can't address universal concerns, but rather because of a intractability in terms of the audience for reading or being able to kind of approach people of color, homosexuals, women, as validly expressing universal concerns. I wonder if you have thoughts about this coming from the very complex subject positions that both of you do.
You want to go first, Brendan?
Sure, I'll try to jump into it. Yeah, no, definitely. I think that there's, I think where the way that Chitra like kind of spoke about the materiality, the smoothness as being something that was, being like almost like making it almost feel like it was like soft, like Noguchi worked with stone, but he made it feel soft. But in that, it kind of like challenged the way that, the material should be, but that also challenges the way that identity should be. And I think for me, that was something that I feel, within the context of how I identify, even in this project, when Daisy, invited me, I was like kind of puzzled, like how do I fit in here? And I was like, I know I fit in here, but now I have to kind of go through the processes of kind of like trying to, kind of like just tear them apart and sort of say that, I am this, but I'm also this, and I can also be this, and I'll be something else tomorrow too. And I think that's kind of the way that, when Chitra again goes back to that materiality, it makes me think about that, the kind of idea that it, Asian American, Daisy said like, because what threw me off was the American part, not the Asian part. I was like, I'm a Kenyan, Canadian, Indian, but yeah, no, I've lived here 20 years, but that's what was throwing me off, because I was like, I'm at this moment, I'm trying to apply for a visa to stay in the country. I don't know if I am, but so it was the American part that threw me off, not that. But then I was like, no, but I am from this space. I am part of this place. And because of, the space of querying within my own practice, I think about it as a self-identifying moniker, self-empowerment, inclusivity. And that's partially where it gets complicated, but it also allows for the sort of social empowering for oneself and to then include others and to bring others in. So when Lisa spoke in the beginning, like it just felt like such an amazing way to think about community space and ways to dismantle and break down binaries. So I think, there is this idea that identity should be static. I always say that ballet is my culture. My culture is not necessarily just through my identity of where I'm from or where I've lived and so forth. It also comes from, punk rock culture for me, but ballet. And so those are the things that also like agitate and complicate the ways that we think about, smooth stone.
Well, for me, I think this letter format that we talk about in this publication is interesting because when I read, I was actually reading this letter. I don't know if you can see, this letter was written between what is this called? Anagram? Like, what is this called? No, what is this called? Like, Aramaic. Like, yeah, like between my mom and my niece. And I know that I shouldn't be reading it, but I was given this letter, so I was reading them. And it's kind of like a time capsule. So I know this time, I know what was going on, but this is not the interaction that I had with neither of them. So by reading these two people's conversation, I have to have a different perspective, right, on the same time that I lived in, or the same space I lived in, right? So when these kind of particular identity like homosexuality or being a specific gender or from a certain region comes into play, I think it's interesting. Like personally, it's interesting because even when I was not raised as an artist and I didn't know so much about art, my professor from college always tells me, she makes fun of me, Amy Podmore, and she says when she asked me who was my favorite artist, I said Michelangelo. Because I didn't know, I mean, like that was sort of like my reference, you know, and but at the same time, I always saw things. There's a perspective. It's not like I lived away from the world. I was looking at things. I had my own experience of, and when I first saw the surface of this, what is so-called Western art or contemporary art, there's a take that I have to this surface, right? So when you start to use it, it's not necessarily language that is in trend or that is easily understood in the timeline of the contemporary art history of that region, right? Because I come from another place, I was raised in another place, so I come from a very specific experience. So when they, who are they, but they use a word such as it is too smooth, or it is Asian, or it is Korean, which is used many times still, right, to describe a certain act that you're doing that is actually more subtle, and it comes from another different kind of knowledge put that has to be understood before you understand why I'm using that language of, say, smooth. Because Noguchi, for example, was using landscape art before his time. In the 30s, he was doing landscape. Why was that not emphasized enough that I know what Noguchi was doing? Why did I always approach Noguchi through this smooth surface stone objects? That is something that the history is doing to the public education, which I entered, you know? So anyway, so that's my take on it. Yeah.
Thank you both for that. And actually, maybe Daisy, if you don't have questions, maybe we can turn to Brendan's excerpt, because I, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I felt, Brendan, as if through this letter, you were trying to understand different facets of Noguchi, very much in the same way that Sung Hong is talking about, right? And not necessarily in terms of our received knowledge of Noguchi, but you were really trying to understand Noguchi, and specifically also through your own practice, which I think there are many parallels there. So I'm wondering, maybe we should turn to Brendan and hear his excerpt about Noguchi.
That would be great.
Thank you, guys. And again, thank you for having me. And yeah, I definitely was trying to figure out, this kind of relationship, this dynamic, because also the invitation from the Noguchi Museum came at the 3-year process. I was in that space as a researcher before I made my project. And so going into that space, and trying to unravel and find materials many that connected with me, I also found more complications. And so it was a really amazing ability to have 3 years to work in a space and then to make something. And so when writing this letter, it came at the end of the exhibition. And so I was kind of coming to this conclusion of I still have questions for you. I still want to know more things about myself, about yourself, and where do these things lay. So that's how I was writing it. And again, the letter is a very intimate space, and I will start to read. So again, just an excerpt. Dear Isamu, I write to you as though we have met, as though we have traveled together, shared meals, and known friends in common, though we have never been in the same place at the same time. Write these words with a sense of kinship. I write knowing that our energies have crossed paths. Why do I feel this way? In part, is we are both hybrids in our identities and in our ways of thinking and making. We are hybrid artists. Our compounded identities have allowed us to maneuver through many spaces, to transgress boundaries, to be in various communities at once. Being resilient and malleable, we have learned to call many places home. In this mobile sense of belonging, we connect to one another. You are Japanese American and you have lived in both countries. I am a Kenyan born Goan, and my family immigrated to Canada in 1989, just after you passed away. I can't help but feel that this is part of our connection. The year we arrived in Canada is also the year I began to dance. I now reside in the United States in Chicago, but I came here to study and to spend time in New York just like you. 3 years ago, I was invited to create a dance work in your former studio in Long Island City, which has become the Isamu Noguchi Foundation and Garden Museum. Through the museum's intervention and invitation, I was able to work in your archives where I found again and again similarities between the ways that we make and think about art. I'm just going to skip to another section. I wonder what you think of the precarious world we're living in today in the United States, especially for being an Asian American. This year, the world has changed with a pandemic in truly unexpected ways, and Asian Americans are being targeted with new hostility and blame. Did you call America home? Did you have to recognize your sense of belonging in this place as a government wages wars against citizens? Home for me has always had many meanings. Canada, Kenya, India, America, all have been my home. And in each I have felt both belonging and a need to be challenged. Looking at your work, I think this is challenging becomes so true to you as well. There seems to be a negotiation at work in your pieces. To understand them best, you have to move, or you have to see them in movement within them. I see them as collaborations. You brought people, space, concepts, and materials together that were not necessarily meant to be together. This has been inspiration for me, and I hope is part of our collaboration. Me being brought together with you might be similar to the inspirations to others. That after all, how do we move forward and become movements ourselves? So I'll stop there. But I thought it was interesting to kind of think about the idea of, just the notion of using the space to create movements, social, political, but also like physical, and how, a big part of my collaboration in the museum with the archive was also just thinking about, his collaborations with dancers, specifically Martha Graham, who I had studied the technique for a number of years. So it's kind of like our narratives were always sort of falling in and out of each other. And there's this one photograph, which I wish I had right now, but it's a photo of Noguchi holding one of his sculptures, which became kind of a prompt for one of my pieces, one of the dances in there. But whenever I kept on seeing the image, I always thought it was me. And it was this, I would always be like, how did they get that picture of me? Because we kind of are the same height and we're both bald. And so it was like this thing where I was always like, this is so uncanny. And so, yeah.
That's such a beautiful story. And I also wanted to ask you, Brendan, because with Hwan and Chitra, there's an actual back and forth. Not that your back and forth is not actual, it's real, but I was wondering if you can talk about the experience of not hearing back, because with Hwan and Chitra, there's a 20-year exchange of back and forths. And
yeah, it was strange because I kept, at the end of my letter, I asked all these other questions, like his relationship to the primitive, his relationship to like Africa, and kind of going back to my narrative, but no answers, because it was me writing in concept, but still there was a sentimentality and a feeling of intimacy that there was this connection because I was in that space for so long. And because I found correlations between our practices always, but yeah, it was interesting to kind of think about writing it, and then not hearing back. It kind of reminded me of like psychoanalysis, where you ask the questions, but you might not get the answers back. So I was kind of playing within that kind of meta space then.
And have you continued to write to him?
I have, and yeah, and it's weird because I've been just kind of writing them, and then I've also been starting to write to a little bit to like including Martha Graham in, because I always thought that our collaboration was the three of us in that exhibition space. And yeah, thinking more about the spaces of like, it's become kind of like a journaling, especially thinking about political space of what's happening today, where I'm asking questions to kind of find resolution for myself as well. So not necessarily just even about, you know, the cultural context of like identity politics, but like about like what we're facing through, you know, social uprisings and through a pandemic as well.
That's really amazing. And there are three words, Brendan, that really struck me about your letter or the excerpts that you read. And those three are hybrid, home, and collaboration. And in some ways, you wouldn't think of the three together, because when you think of home, you almost think of a stable concept and place. And in some ways, hybridity and collaboration are destabilizing. And so this question is both for Brendan and also for Hwan, having in some ways, Brendan kind of, you know, as Daisy said, true, really, but also metaphorically collaborated with Martha Graham, well, studying, okay, fine. So you studied Martha Graham, so that's real. And then, but kind of metaphorically collaborating with Martha Graham and Noguchi, whom the two of them had collaborated before. And then with Hwan, this collaboration with Shitra. I want to ask you if these interpersonal relationships generated a kind of different or more interesting concept of home. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense, but I definitely think that that goes back to this kind of space that, you know, like a binary, that home should be one place, right? And I think that, you know, for me, I've always learned that home is many places. Like, you know, I remember moving from Canada to America to move to New York, and I was like, I have to negotiate home again. And I need to find that. And I think because of my trajectories of movement, I've found that I'm fortunate that I have many homes to be able to go to. Right now, it is challenging to get to those homes, but like there's still like, you know, traces of familiarity or actual human interactions or communities. And so for me, I just think that that's the kind of idea of dismantling that home doesn't have to be one place. And that was one thing that Noguchi always, you know, did. He went between Japan and America. He was never just in one place. And so that was something else that was interesting for me to think about, was the idea that, you know, being like Asian American for him was actually, you know, transgressing different geographic locations and spending time and experiencing and bringing back and forth, which I think that kind of exchange is the most fruitful type. And sometimes we know that in our communities and our societies, we fear the other, right? If we don't understand something, we fear it. And so I think that's why, you know, for me, if I'm dropped into a different place, I'm happy to kind of start figuring it out. You know, it allows me to become a more complex being.
Definitely, to answer the question short, it's the I was just in Korea until last week, and I was having a conversation with my mom, and I was having a conversation about the time that I knew her as a high school student, and now I am living the age that she was living when I was in high school. So there are things that I didn't, we couldn't have the conversation about, that I'm beginning to know, and it's an intimate conversation that begins to redefine what that home was, you know, because we have a very different take on what that experience was, because we're in different stage in our life, even within what is called the most intimate community group between mother and son, could have a different redefining moment through a conversation. So definitely with Chitra and I, just asking questions, sometimes very naive questions, like, oh, I didn't know that you thought that way, or like, you know, like we're like, I'm not, for example, Asian American, I'm not, I'm a green card holder, what does it mean? So I look at it, when I look at these events that happened to Asian Americans in early 20th century, it is a time when that idea of the passport or the undocumented immigrant, this kind of concept starts to happen because people start to just flow into the United States, to this continent, and they start to regulate who can come in more and who are not supposed to be here. And they start to define who is undocumented, who should be undocumented, who should be documented, right? So by looking, and it's not like Chitra, although she lived here all her life, she didn't know, she wasn't educated with these data or information or history because of her upbringing or where she grew up or the school she went to, right? So it is not that by default that just because you're here, you have a homogeneous idea about what home is, right? So we discover together through this kind of interactions, I think.
That's beautiful. I wonder if we shouldn't open it up to, well, Lisa, Rachel, and A4, and maybe to audience members. What do you think, Daisy?
Yeah, let's open it up to the audience. I see that there's some questions in the chat.
Yeah, people feel free to either drop them into the Q&A or into the chat. Of course, the most important question is, you know, Almond Roca or Ferrero Rocher, right? No, I would like to just start out because I mean, you know, the breadth and the scope and the letters, they're so vast and so poignant and different and sad and touching and funny and all of these things. And they open up so many issues. And I'm just curious about you, Chris and Daisy, after reflecting on all of these, like what other continuing conversations would you like to have, or would you like to see? What other questions would you like to pose?
By the way, the Ferrero Rocher and Almond Roca was a prompt to our contributors, which they would like, because a lot of Asian families have these kind of like in battles in their house and like have their preferences. But one thing that I guess, you know, Brendan and also Sungwon was talking about, it's, you know, how do you, there is something really generous and supportive of saying like Asian American and feeling like part of a community, but there's also so many differentiations. And how do you kind of keep the particulars that keep you as who you are? I mean, no one is monolithic. There's so many parts of who we are as human beings, and get to be in the world in that way and feel like they can thrive in that world. And so how do we not confuse those things? Like in some cases, you know, feeling part of something that is under this umbrella of Asian American is really beneficial, and sometimes it's not. And so just kind of ongoing discussions about that is something that has been on my mind.
And just to echo what Daisy is saying, we do have a comment from an audience member, Young-hee Kim, who writes, I actually think identity politics are negative for people who fall into the intersectionality of multiples or hyphenated identities. And then, you know, I recommend Jose Esteban Muniz's book, Cruising Utopia, and then and there of queer futurity. So I think that kind of echoes what Daisy is saying. I also want to point out that Asian American, to go back to something Brendan said, which was he had problems with the American part, not the Asian part. And then to point out something that both Sung-Hwan and Brendan said, which is that they are either waiting for or without green card, either waiting for a green card or, you know, in Sung-Hwan's case, without a green card. Where I would like to see the discussion about racial identity go is, I would like to see it go global, which is to say, I think that there are discussions to be had about racial identity that involve not just the Asian diaspora, but any diaspora, and discussions to be had that emerge from other very different cultural contexts than in the West and specifically in North America. So I think that there, as Lisa said, and some people, of course, in the book, address this, and for me, it was an eye-opener of the way that we've really only scratched the surface when it comes to these discussions.
Chris, there was a question also from Katie in the Q&A. So she said that she's fascinated and invested in this question of home, and she's curious how you sort of reckon with these multiple identifications with what home is from within, sort of putting the physical locations aside. So in other words, what is home, identity inside yourself when it's many places in the world? And also thank you for this incredible conversation. So perhaps you can talk a little bit more about that.
I would love to, but I would also love to hear from Brendan and Sung-Hwan, who have really thought about this. So maybe I'll cede the floor to Brendan and Sung-Hwan to either respond to Katie's question or the previous question and comment, and then I can hop in as well, of course.
Yeah, I was just wanted to mention that, like just thinking about the Munez Cruising Utopia, because I think that book is really important. It's a piece that I use in a lot of my teaching, because I feel like within that kind of queer space, there's also this kind of question that, we can be like within a non-binary space, but the fractures can still kind of exist within the multiplicity and dimensionality. So I just wanted to kind of posit that when I think about hybridity, I do think about it through queering and something that's constantly in change. So, because for me, queer spaces are ones that are never fully identified. They will kind of keep on changing and moving and becoming something else. And so within that, the utopic idea is kind of not fully ever formed. And so then thinking about that with regards to home, then I also question, the ideas that, home can also be kind of constantly growing and changing, which for me is then the queer space as well. And again, that space doesn't have to be a physical house. I think we think about home as those things. Home is, for me, sometimes is an airport. Most of the times when we were in days before the pandemic, I was hotel rooms and airports were spaces of feeling, just because I think, Chris, because you said there's that idea of stability, like, I always wanted to stay in a very like clinical, same kind of hotel because it gave me familiarity. Whatever city I was in, I just knew I had the things that made me feel comfort. And so that was just something, again, I just was thinking about, about the notion of home and homemaking, or like, hotels and airports became spaces for that feeling of comfort.
Well, you can't, I guess one can answer this in so many different directions, but I was just thinking how, I think it's good to, like, if you delete one of the things that is important in relation to what you think of it as a home, and then you are able to sort of like think about what that is. Sometimes I wonder, like I was how do you go, disowned. Yeah, I was disowned by my father once, and so I was kicked out of the house when I around the time that I met Chitra, actually, and then as you leave the house, you think that then, because I went back afterwards, but then I thought, oh, I'll never come back here, or I'll never have these ties anymore, right? Then there's this, you're in a very different state psychologically, and you start to wonder about the people who never had that also, because you have the privilege of knowing both when you lose something. And then I think about, like, for example, Noguchi, like, too, he's lived in the United States more than he had in Japan, and he knew more culturally about American education and culture than he did of Japan. But to see in his life a country where he's associated with, bombed by another country that he grew up with, totally, with these new weapons, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What does it mean, like, for him to see that, right? So I think that like deletion of something that you connect, if you delete the idea that is connected to the idea of the home that you have, I think you begin to sort of like know that there is something in that periphery of that concept. What home is, I don't know. I was just think that's just what I thought as I listened to you, Brandon.
I think that is an incredible observation, especially as well. It's not even the elephant in the room because it's quite explicit, but of course, the term that is in play in both this book and possibly in this conversation is Asian American and the home of Asian Americans in this nation state that we call the United States. So I think that these reflections on home are absolutely spot on. We do have, I know we have to wrap up soon. I just want to put on the table 2 comments. One is from Rachel Ossip, who writes, I find both queerness and artistic practices move us to constellate new lineages, finding home in people who share our reference points and constellations, collaborators as family, home as being with them. And I love that idea of a chosen family. Let's say you're disowned by your biological family, and so and then from Ciesla Foundation, someone at the foundation, thank you for these important reflections and ideas about home and historicism. Could the panelists, Brendan, Hwan, talk about how the project might influences their practices going forward? I think that will be a good, how about we end on that question, or end on the answer to that question. I love the future orientation of that question. So Hwan and Brendan?
What, so the project meaning which project?
I think probably the reference is to your dialogue with Shitra and maybe how that might influence. I mean, a lot is happening in your life, someone. You're doing a lot. So, I mean, I don't even know if you have the time or capacity to think about the future, having so much on your plate in the present, but, just in case, if maybe it'll impact your future work.
No, it definitely does. I mean, I think that was a premise of this kind of book as well, to have, because there's something that is public and something that is documented, and that is something that is educated, and then it goes into the collective memory and the knowledge of the society. And then there are things that are not spoken, or they were spoken, not heard, or not documented, and then or deleted after it's documented, right? So the conversation that I have with Chitra or people that I love or that I find interesting, who I love, are about discovering these things, and it's exciting because that rejuvenates the life that you're living, because you think it's a wall and then you realize it's transparent. You can go through it, you can walk around it, or there are things that you didn't know that allows you to walk through the space that you thought was not allowed, right? So I think these conversation and the project definitely informs me. And especially when it's published, you read it again. That's a great thing. And then another person read it. And then based on that experience of having read the same book or the same document, you start to have another layer of the conversation. And that's exciting. And that's what projects could mean, I think.
Yeah, similar for me. I think this moment of also writing the letter, took on the current moment in time. And so for me, I was really questioning process, new forms of making, ways that I need to do things outside of my normal ways of making because I can't. And so really thinking about future possibilities and new forms of collaboration. So I think that has just been something that was really, was a big part of the piece at Noguchi, working with the concepts and ideas of space and materials, and also Martha Graham, but then also working with my dancers who were major collaborators, but now we can't even meet together. So how do we do that in a time when we can't even be intimate? So the letter was a very emotive way to express. But normally when I'm in a studio, we express that way with our bodies. And so I'm trying to figure out ways to do that in this moment in time. So new forms, you know, future possibilities is kind of like the ways that I'm trying to move forward.
I love ending on new futures. That is perfect. I hate to end the conversation because it was so great. I want to thank you all so much for sharing, for being with us tonight, Chris and Daisy, for making this beautiful book happen. Thank you, Rachel. Everybody, buy the book. Go see Hwan's show at MoMA when it's out. Thank you all again for joining us tonight. I hope you'll stay in touch with us. We have lots of great programs coming up, and we have a calendar that lists upcoming events, and we try to track things. So when we find out about great things that are happening on, you know, Brendan and Hwan's multiple list of things, we'll try to add them to our calendar too. So again, thank you all. Join us again and have a great night, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.